All stands. The Coronial Court stands resumed. Please be seated. Yes, Ms. Davis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, my name is Julia Pincus. I'm one of the lawyers representing the Walker, Lane and Robertson families. I just have two quick questions for you. One is we already have evidence that about 25% of the Northern Territory Police Force is composed of ex-military personnel, whether from ADF or foreign military services. And we also have some evidence that there is a propensity for there to be PTSD or some sort of moral injury, as we discussed earlier, as a result of serving in the military service. And then that then leads to potential for...
I don't know if there's propensity, it's a higher risk factor.
There is a risk factor. You're right, yes. And then in the event that there are instances of PTSD or moral injury, then there is a possibility that that would lead to increased aggression and increased force used in arrest. If we accept that, do you think there is any wisdom in the Northern Territory Police Force doing its own psychological testing of all ex-military personnel to specifically identify whether or not this is the case in particular applicants, noting your earlier evidence that it's too much to be testing everyone, but just to use this as sort of an identifiable risk group?
I personally don't know if we could distinguish the higher risk for experienced police officers from a military veteran cohort within the police force. So I would think in general it would be useful to help people identify what might be psychological injuries because of their occupational exposures. But I think the same suggestion could be applied to cohort of experienced police officers in relation to inherent risk of exposure and the increased risk because of that for developing trauma-related responses.
Right. I mean, I suppose...
As opposed to just military veterans within the police force.
Look, without labouring the point, I suppose I was getting to more that the concept of the distinction of what is expected in the military versus the police, the sort of concept of going from being warriors in effect to guardians. So that being a distinction as opposed to people who have already served in the police force elsewhere.
I'm unsure about what the question is now. Sorry.
So that's okay. So it was really identifying ex-military, notwithstanding that they come with lots of positive attributes in terms of discipline and teamwork, etc., but the fact that they have been trained in a very different way in terms of their direction to kill as opposed to protect potentially, would be reason enough to do specific psychological testing on that group.
I think there's some assumptions about training, and I think there are differences in training around use of force, but there's also multiple contexts in which I would assume military veterans have been trained to act in different ways in terms of using force, and within a military context would have demonstrated variation in terms of how they might use force. I think the point I'm picking up is that would it be useful to ensure that there is useful and functional retraining of certain aspects, such as around use of force? And I think my short answer to that would be yes, and that would be an additional component for training and attention if it was someone from a military background or someone especially from another policing jurisdiction who have different protocols in terms of how they engage and train.
Thanks very much. And then just secondly, very quickly, do you have any, can you talk about the potential effects that a diagnosis of depression may have on the performance of the duties of a police officer?
Well, I think in general, it could have multiple effects, including just around the key linkages to symptoms of depression. And I suppose what I would pay attention to, if someone had a severe level of depressive symptoms and over an enduring point of time, is the impact upon their executive functioning, so the capacity to think and solve problems, and a potential likelihood that will become more difficult for them managing safety critical decisions on the job.
And in
So
view
there'd be a performance deficit.
Thank you. And in view of that, is your view that it would be, that there should be mandatory self-reporting to supervisors in the event that there has been some sort of mental health diagnosis of depression, etc.?
I think mandatory reporting of specific mental health conditions and health conditions is one approach. I don't think it would actually be effective, and I think as long as there's a possibility that people can access support and not report it, which there would be, then if people were worried and perceiving the impact of stigma or perceiving the impact of a negative management of that disclosure within the organisation, probably the most needy people in terms of support wouldn't report it anyway.
Right.
So I think,
but wouldn't they also be the people who wouldn't necessarily seek the services of the ESS for the same reason?
and potentially be impacted by accessing support in general, whether internally or beyond the organisation. Yes.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
Mr. McMahon?
Can I just have 3 minutes if I may? Mr. Van Hypten, my name is Manak for the Parempuru Committee, which is a Justice Committee of Yuendamu, and we're very focused on the future and the application of learnings from this inquest. I want to ask you just one issue, which is about changing the culture in a workplace. And if you think that you're not qualified to answer the question, then just tell me and I'll sit down. But I'm drawing on your long experience with the Northern Territory Police and as a psychologist. And I want to put a couple of propositions to you and then seek your input on how you might assist the inquest by commenting on changing culture in the workplace, all right? So I think we can take it as a given that we accept that people can change. For instance, from being someone with racist views to non-racist views or anti-racist views, or vice versa, and so on. And that will depend on your colleagues and various dramatic incidents in your life and so on. And we've had officers in this case sitting in the witness box shedding tears when they reflect on the mistakes that they've made in the past that have been exposed in this inquest. You understand?
Yes.
So just accepting for a moment, and these are controversial points, and I'm not asking you to take them as proven or anything like that, but just accepting for a moment that there was the workplace at the Alice Springs Police Station where racist language was freely used, that there was too much acceptance of excessive force against Aboriginal people, and there was too much emphasis on getting the job done over the ethics of a particular situation, such as a forceful arrest and using excessive force and so on. Okay, just accept that there was a climate like that at the relevant time. And then my question to you is, everyone knows that such a climate needs to be fixed and changed, and from a psychologist's point of view, are you able to assist us in saying, when you have a workplace which has got some fairly long-term and troubling problems like the ones I've identified, if you're asked the question, well, how do you change that from a psychologist's point of view? Are you able to contribute to this inquest by answering that question?
I think just briefly and conceptually, and I would say yes.
Well, go on, please.
So I think one aspect of that would be that there's a demonstration of desired values as well as behaviours within leadership, and that's frequently demonstrated through rank. I think there's a component of that due attention is given to when discovered if inappropriate behaviours and attitudes are demonstrated, that it's action, and that anyone that observes it and needs to report it has a safe mechanism for doing that without any negative repercussions to themselves or others. I think the workforce needs to perceive significant efficacy in any of those interventions, otherwise they'll dismiss them as being ineffective and won't trust that that'll have any change. And I think there needs to be some process for people to remediate their behaviours and be accepted back into the organisation. Otherwise, it still encourages those behaviours to be kept in the dark and not reported, and it discourages people from an opportunity to change their behaviours. Sorry, I was just going to say, and I think this is a significant component, is that the landscape of the workforce needs to be representative of the community. And I know there's lots of attempts and lots of difficulties in doing that in terms of recruitment, and then around the complications, and I think especially for Indigenous peoples within the NT, of policing within their own communities. I would perceive that as far from a simple context for anyone to be living and working, but I think all of those efforts in combination are some measures.
So just 3 quick points then. It's clear that your answer is not off the cuff. This is something you've thought deeply about over a long time. Do you agree with that?
That's correct.
Okay, just in order to assess the weight of your answer. Secondly, can I add one further additional point, and in light of what you've said, it seems that one thing that may be missing in the armoury of police command is the ability to act quite rapidly and decisively when they need to send a very severe message to the workforce. That is, should there be a clear mechanism and a clear route for police command to be able to say, given that police officer's done A, B and C, you're out of the workforce starting today. At least suspended and possibly out of the workforce. Is that one of the many levers which you should have available?
I would disagree that there are not those opportunities and levers, and I think there are those, and I would have witnessed those occurring over time, but not uniformly applied across process or across events.
And finally, in terms of the very first point you made about leadership, it seems likely that to the extent that there is a serious and strong focus on showing the entire workforce the importance of strong and ethical leadership, that will filter down through the workforce and create a culture in the workforce. You agree with that?
Yes, I agree.
But that'll do. Thank you.
Mr. Officer?
Yes, thank you, Your Honour. Mr. Van Hoeften, my name's Luke Officer. I act for Constable Zachary Rolfe. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
I just want to ask you, based on your expertise as a psychologist, just some information arising from the psychometric testing. I'm not asking you to interpret it, but that is a report which gives information about personality traits, isn't it?
Some of the information in the report is about personality traits, yes.
Yes, and would you agree that personality traits that can change or develop over time?
I'm not an expert on personality, so I'll offer a general response to that. So I would assume that personality traits are relatively stable over time, but with an intervention and right motivation, people can become aware of strong personality traits, and if motivated, can modify their behaviour. For instance, from antisocial outcomes as a result of strong personality traits to more pro-social for some people, depending on the severity and depending on the personality trait.
So can you or can you not comment on why a report of this nature has I suppose, an expiration on it? This report you'll see on page 1, it's valid to a certain date, which is 12 months. Are you able to comment on why there's a validity period?
Yes, I can.
Why is
some
that?
of the information is modifiable. So some information, such as symptoms associated with depression or a mood disorder, it's likely that those things could change within 12 months. It's less likely for other attributes that are assessed within the psychometric battery, such as personality traits, will change within that period of time. So they'd remain consistent.
So is aggression one of those that could change or remain consistent?
Aggression as a personality trait?
Well, is it a personality trait only, or is it some other form of characteristic?
Well, if the psychometric assessment is measuring aggression by static variables such as past behaviours, that'll remain consistent because it's a historic event. If it's about a propensity to use violence in the future, that might change because that might be attitudinally based.
All right. And what about the making of a mistake and less likely to accept responsibility? Is that something that can change over time?
That would be very contingent upon the reason why the mistake was made.
All right, so it's all fact sensitive or circumstance sensitive.
Yeah. So it's circumstance and characteristic sensitive.
And what about the trait of having a tough father? Is that something that can change over a period of time in terms of how you approach authority?
Well, having a tough upbringing and a poor relationship with a parent is not going to change over time if it's already happened. How the person manages that exposure and how they make sense and meaning of it and how they manage their own behaviour in similar circumstances would potentially change over time. If that kind of upbringing has led to the development of personality characteristics or entrenched attitudes and beliefs, well then that's less likely to change over time, but possible.
You need more information about the nature of the relationship to be able to form an opinion on whether or not it could change. Is that the effect of your evidence?
Correct. And someone's perception of a tough relationship with the father might be very different to the person that they're sitting next to.
Yes, certainly. And of those 3 traits or characteristics of a person I've taken you to, do learned experiences, in particular in relation to being a police officer, will that have an impact on how those traits or characteristics develop or not?
Potentially.
And those traits or characteristics, they're not unusual in an individual, are they?
Are you suggesting what would be the prevalence rate for those traits or characteristics?
Yes, is it something that Constable Rolfe having those 3 traits strikes you as odd, unusual, or have you seen that in a number of people you've assessed before?
They would have been characteristics flagged in reports for other candidates, yes.
So it's not unusual?
Not unusual.
And you qualify this at your statement, don't you, at 9.5, where you say an individual's psychological characteristics are one set of variables in the context of their behaviour in a given situation. So are those characteristics or traits situational as opposed to global, or both?
So the personality traits, for example, would be consistent across situations. The choices that they have in that situation about how to act, their level of distress, other factors that might be impacting their decision making would be variables that could change across situations.
Yes, again, so it's all fact sensitive or circumstance sensitive.
Well, they're all relative.
Well, because you go on to say, pre-employment risk assessments are not able to account for the subsequent training and resources personnel may have at their disposal, the culture of the organisations or work units in which they will work, or the situations in which they may be deployed to undertake high-risk tasks and in-the-moment decisions.
Correct. That was
So-
my statement.
So those characteristics of an individual or personality traits may or may not be apparent or may not have an impact depending on the situation that presents that person who holds those traits at the time.
I would suggest that personality traits and values and beliefs and attitudes would have a fairly significant impact on people's behaviour in different situations.
Yes, so it depends on the situation, doesn't it?
No, that's the opposite to what I'm saying. I'm saying it would be fairly consistent across situations.
Well, but why do you say that the pre-employment risk assessments can't account for example, the situations in which they may be deployed to undertake high-risk tasks and in-the-moment decisions?
Because it's not the only variable
So what other variables?
in
are you
relation
talking-
to the decision making.
So what other variables are you talking about?
So other examples in addition to the ones that are provided,
Yes.
such as mental health conditions, the role that they have in terms of decision making, the scope and resources that they have.
What about having to make decisions in a high-stress situation?
That would be a variable.
What about having to make decisions in high-stress situations with very little time?
Yes, so under pressure, that would be another variable in terms of decision making.
And does training have an impact? When I talk about training for police officers and what they're accustomed to with their training, is that another variable?
Yes. And I think that strong stable characteristics such as personality will guide how people make decisions when the stress is elevated.
You gave some evidence in relation to counsel assisting about threat perception and sensitisation and desensitisation. And my note, which is somewhat paraphrasing it, in terms of desensitisation, people not appreciating a level of aggression as significant because of overexposure to situations. Do you recall that evidence?
Yes.
And the example that was given to you by Mr. Coleridge was that a police officer who attends half a dozen reports of domestic violence and keeps seeing the same thing over and over again, is that one of those circumstances or experience which might lead to desensitisation?
Yes, potentially.
But that requires, does it not, repetition of the exact same event time and time again. Do you agree or disagree?
Or similar events.
Or similar. So,
Yeah.
for example, if a police officer has never been involved in a situation where in very quick time they are subjected to a rapid and violent assault, that wouldn't necessarily be one of those instances where you say that they've been desensitised because of an overexposure to situations, would you? It's completely different to the repetitive conduct which might give you desensitisation. Do you agree?
So I agree, exposure to a unique event that someone hadn't experienced before is different to repeat exposure to an event.
Yes, and so in those unique events, when we talk about characteristics and having in mind your qualification at paragraph 9.5, which I've read to you, is it the case that an individual in that situation would fall back on their training and decisions they make in the moment?
And I would say the decisions that they make, as well as the training, will be influenced by their attitudes and values.
Yes, that's what I have.
Thank you. Dr. Fredericton?
Thank you, Anne. Mr. Van Heften, I'd just like to ask you first about the what's been called the psychometric testing that was provided by the AIFP, whose results were given to you. Can you characterise the focus of that testing?
So a component of it is around aptitude, so numeracy, literacy, and IQ in general. And then there's another component around personality traits that might present high risk to the occupation that the person's applying for, and in this case, recruit constable. There's a list of other factors around desirable attitudes or undesirable attitudes, not reflected in the report for Mr. Rolfe, but often reported in others is around, sexist or racist attitudes, discriminatory attitudes. So there's a component of that. And then also some questions around what might be other psychological disorders, but not personality based. So things like depression and or anxiety. There's other components within that are relative to high-risk occupations, which is attitudes towards working within teams, and questions that might guide how people respond to situations of stress.
Put another way, a carefully compiled set of focuses appropriate for assessment of suitability of a person for the police force or the emergency services.
Yes, I'd say all of those characteristics are relevant to performing well and staying healthy in law enforcement emergency services positions.
But not a test which of itself is diagnostic.
No.
And so it wouldn't of itself readily identify whether someone was a psychopath.
No, it wouldn't.
And in fact, if someone were a psychopath, they might well manoeuvre their answers in such a way as to present themselves appropriately for the task of completing an assessment form of this kind, or form or a set of answers.
I think with considerable effort in completing the test battery, that would be possible to modify your answers.
Yeah. And likewise, it's not a battery which would per se identify a personality disorder.
No. But
Nor,
potentially screen for issues of relevance, but not diagnostic.
but what you've identified is that it may well uncover at least features of an anxiety or depressive disorder.
Yes, that's correct.
But not so much so for post-traumatic stress disorder?
I don't think so.
That leaves it important, I suppose, then, for the members of the interviewing panel to pick up on any issues raised by the psychometric testing and explore them orally in an exchange with the applicant.
Correct.
And how long did you spend with each applicant in picking up such issues and engaging in structured and free discourse with each applicant?
Sorry, can you repeat the end of the question?
Yes, of course. How long did you spend talking to each applicant on the basis of the testing and the answers given to the structured questions that you posed?
So in general, for the sections that I would ask between 15 and 20 minutes, given that the entire interview was generally completed within 60 minutes.
So approximately an hour amongst the three members of the panel.
Yes,
And you tended to split the questioning into three roughly equal sections.
that's correct.
And was there a particular component of the questioning allocated to you as a psychologist, remember?
Yes, so the psychologist on the panel generally asked a section that was titled personal problems or problem areas, and the psychologist on the panel did the follow-up questioning for any critical items, including any specific questions from the personal history questionnaire.
And were there particular issues which, in that context, you followed up with Mr. Rolfe?
Yes,
Which ones were those? Just describing them generically.
yes, so there were 3 critical items that were put to Mr. Rolfe to provide further information on. There was consideration given to the personal history questionnaire,
Yes.
but no further questions were asked about the responses because I'm assuming, I would have presumed he's provided those details within the interview already, as was covered this morning.
And issues arose out of the psychometric testing in terms of recourse to aggression and responsiveness to guidance from authority figures. Is that right?
Yes,
Were you the one who particularly followed up on those?
yes, I posed those critical items and asked for feedback about why he had responded in the way he had.
And just in broad terms, it's apparent, and I'll go to the details in a moment, that you were satisfied in respect of those matters. How did you come to be so satisfied?
I don't know.
Okay.
So I would have, if there was critical information that suggested further risk, that would have been written down
Okay.
by myself or the other candidate.
All right. So if there was such, does such information come out in relation to those kinds of matters in the course of questioning from time to time with applicants?
Yes,
And what's
and if that was the case, verbatim responses would generally be written down as to their explanations of why they endorse a particular critical item. Hence my assumption that if that information isn't there, none of that was detected or reported by Mr. Roth.
And broadly, what percentage of people are found to not to satisfy the criteria for suitability for being appointed a police officer by this whole process?
Are you talking about once they get to interview?
Once they get to interview, yes, thank you, Anna.
I think generally there's attrition of about 70 to 80%. So if a recruitment drive interviewed 100 people, generally between 20 to 30 would be found suitable.
And Mr. Rolfe fell into that category?
Yes,
Now, I wonder if you could locate, and if not, I'll ask it to be shown to you, the report that you gave recommending advancement for Mr. Rolfe, which is in for your honour's benefit, page 159 of 221. In 7-1.
That's document 7, the first page.
Thank you very much. Do you have that available to you, sir?
is that the first page of the interview guide that I completed?
It's the it has the candidate's name and then interviewing officer comments, and this has your name attached to it and your signature. And there are 4 boxes, one of them being top, one of which is ticked.
Yes,
All right.
got that page.
Thank you. Now, it's apparent from there, recognising that you don't have a memory of the actual interview with Mr. Rolfe, do you? that you found him to be well presented and confident, forthcoming and honest.
Yes.
What's the process by which you form an evaluation as to whether someone has been honest at interview?
I think a component about their responses to questions. So it'd be perceived as a level of dishonesty if people were evasive about answering questions and had to be prompted multiple times to be fully, to provide a full answer to a question. If people had been consistent with their responses throughout, not only at interview, but consistent reporting of information as per within the psychometric testing, within the personal history questionnaire and at interview as well. There's some examples.
The second matter which you notate in your interviewing officer comments is that self-report suggests that Zach has a high level of resilience and well practiced with self-management skills. I want to ask you about the self-report aspect of this. To what extent in your evaluative process are you reliant upon self-report?
For aspects like that, apart from the psychometric report, the rest of the information is primarily self-report at interview.
How does anything anomalous which is uncovered by your questioning factor into the evaluative process?
So if, for instance, there was feedback at the medical assessment that might have happened after someone had progressed through the interview,
Yes.
and it determined that, there was ill health or contrary information that suggested someone actually didn't have a high level of resilience for either fitness or mental health, that would be point for reconsideration. Also, if at reference checking, though highly dubious that you get critical information from nominated referees,
Yes.
that could be another opportunity to do that. And also, if someone reported high levels of physical fitness and or capacity to sustain good performance in stressful situations but didn't demonstrate that in
Yes.
person at interview, that would cause question for their self-report.
So any kind of inconsistency feeds into the evaluative process, is that right?
Yes, correct.
In number 4 of your comments, you refer to Mr. Rolfe as having demonstrated sound ethical, pragmatic problem solving and interpersonal skills at interview.
Yes.
What sorts of considerations enabled you to arrive at that conclusion?
So I think often that was more easily detected in people's responses to the scenario questions, where they had to consider multiple options in terms of dealing with the situation and weighing that up, and then explaining those things. But throughout the interview, how people engaged with the panel as a whole, their level of respect, their capacity to manage questions that were difficult or pointed, and sustain the interaction within the panel interview as well.
And you've already referred to referee reports. Is referee material available to you to assist in your evaluation?
Not at the time of the interview. That would occur afterwards.
That's next.
Yeah.
All right, that's helpful, thank you. And you ultimately described Mr. Rolfe as a prime candidate for future development within the organisation. What did you mean by that?
Based on his performance at interview and the overall feedback within the psychometric report, that he might be suitable for progression, not only through the training program, but also make opportunities in terms of leadership and performance, a high level of performance within the role.
So this goes beyond mere acceptability for entry into the police force, but it's a comment from you about his potential for advancement.
Yes.
Now, your panel's recommendation, and here it was for advancement, isn't the last word, is it? Because the actual decision making is done by a challenge panel.
That's correct.
And without naming the people on the challenge panel, how many individuals are on there?
Generally 3.
and they receive a report from the 3 members on your panel, is that right?
So they would receive a summary, which is basically those comments from each panel member.
Yes.
They have an opportunity to ask questions of the panel members. Generally, all 3 will be available to attend. They also have the file at their disposal, and generally by the time the challenge panel occurs, other information such as referee checks, medical assessments,
Yes.
probity assessments might be pending or might be there on file as well for review.
In terms of the probity information, is the probity checking undertaken between the time of your work and when the challenge panel looks at the situation?
I think it would generally commence after the panel interview.
Right.
So it wouldn't be proceeded with for applicants that weren't recommended, but may not
Yes.
be available at the time that the challenge panel met, which I think was the case with some of the checks for Mr. Rolfe.
And you've been present at a number of challenge panel hearings.
Yes.
And can you describe to her on how long a process and that exercise is in respect of an applicant, and whether that panel routinely accepts what comes from your panel?
So I think generally between 1 or 2 hours off the top of my head. It's been a long time since I participated in one. Generally,
For how many applicants?
in different processes. So if time was a constraint, well, then it would just be for the applicants that were being recommended
Yes.
to progress. And time wouldn't be spent talking about applicants where there was consensus for not progressing. And then for each applicant, a summary would be provided by the panel, usually by the chair of the interview panel to the chair of the challenge panel.
Yes.
And any questions could be provided. It's also an opportunity for any of the panel members to present any concerns, and generally there'd be feedback at that point in time about any further assessments that were pending, whether that's medical, referee checks, or the probity criminal history checks as well.
And what are the potential outcomes from the challenge panel? Obviously, a person can simply be accepted as suitable, or they can be rejected outright by the challenge panel. Are there other outcomes between those two possibilities?
Yes, there could be a discussion around, is there further information that's required?
Yes.
If risk information was discovered in the process of probity checks, there might be discussion around exclusion criteria for any further applications, which could be essentially wouldn't consider an application from this person at any point or a period of years, and an explanation why. So that level of discussion might happen at those challenge panel meetings if necessary.
Can the person be accepted as suitable for employment subject to certain conditions or a review period?
So for the candidate,
Yes.
the candidate may get an offer of employment, and there's an example of the letter on file that Mr. Rolfe would have received. Within it includes a number of caveats, including the discovery of information that might negatively impact or require reconsideration of his application, ranging from criminal history, probity, discovery of any dishonesties throughout the process, and or any medical or reference checks or other misconduct in other employment as well would be covered within that.
What if there was an ongoing concern about the person's capacity to respond appropriately to guidance, or an ongoing concern about their propensity to overreact in circumstances of stress? Could that result in any kind of a conditional offer of employment?
I don't think I was ever aware of conditions being set within employment.
Right.
And generally, if there are those types of concerns, the probably the natural question would be, should we be offering the person the position?
Mr. Van Heften, you've had reason for a period of time now to reflect upon the process as it applied to Mr. Rolfe. Do you have any final observations that you'd like to provide to Her Honour in terms of the recruitment process for the Northern Territory Police Force in the future?
Yes, I think a reflection that's been developing over the course of today and through the questions is that similar to the question posed about desensitisation to aggression or violence, I think as panel members, we get exposed to a range of different stories from people, as well as the information that we have from experience of working within the organisation, and for myself, the experience of working as a psychologist within the organisation. And I don't think, which is the point of my reflection, that the challenge panels are immune from the same processes of desensitisation or sensitisation. And I think this may be an example where the challenge panel might have been more acutely sensitised to descriptions of violence posed by the candidate, or maybe impacted in terms of accepting a level of aggression that was used in the example provided, a courageous example of use of aggression to protect someone else, but viewed it essentially in an acceptable way because of the context of the occupation.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Ron.
I've got perhaps 2 minutes.
Sure.
The first question I wanted to ask you, Mr. Van Heften, picks up on something that you were asked by Mr. McMahon. He suggested to you that there should be mechanisms in place for swift action to be taken by the Northern Territory Police Executive, either to suspend or terminate in certain circumstances. And as I understood your answer, it was that you thought that those mechanisms were in place, but that they were not uniformly applied in all circumstances. If I've correctly understood your answer, I wondered whether you could just explain what that last part of your answer meant.
Yeah, like without being able to provide examples, I think I was aware of decisions that could be made decisively if there was consensus around potential risk with employees, and of some employees being dismissed through probation periods for making poor judgments that were deemed as dishonesty, and then other circumstances where that level of decisiveness hasn't been demonstrated.
Do you have, and again without giving examples, a sense of why decisions were being made inconsistently?
I think in part because different people were making different decisions at different points in time, and that the variables of each situation would be taken in consideration, and that might be one reason why there's a variation in time frame or decisiveness.
The second topic I wanted to ask you about briefly was this issue of personality traits. As I understood your answer, it was that personality traits tend to be relatively stable, but with intervention can be changed. Is that correct?
I intended to present that personality traits are relatively enduring, but for people motivated to, they could manage the impact of those personality traits to minimise the negative impact on themselves and to others.
But I take it from your answer that without motivation, self-awareness and intervention, it's unlikely that those enduring personality traits will be managed in a way that they don't have an effect on behaviour.
Correct. I agree.
Would you agree that one type of one type of intervention might be positive mentoring within an organisation like the Northern Territory Police Force?
Yes.
So providing a good example of positive or desirable behaviours?
Yes. Would be one method of intervention.
Another example is disciplinary action for undesirable behaviours, correct?
Yes.
And would you agree that if there isn't intervention, and if in fact the environment reinforces undesirable personality traits, the risk is that those personality traits will be a quite significant influence on a person's decision making?
Yes, potentially.
Just following up on that issue of personality traits, you were then asked some questions about variables, other variables that can affect decision making in specific circumstances. And two variables identified by Mr. Officer were high stress and time pressures. In situations of high stress where a person is under time pressures, am I correct in thinking that people are more likely to fall back on underlying personality traits?
And to fall back on their underlying system of values to guide their decisions.
And so, if, for example, you have a set of personality traits that an institution tries to train you out of, or train you in such a way that they don't have such an effect on your decision making, in situations of very high stress, the training might have less of an effect on your decision making, and the underlying personality traits and values might have more of an effect on your decision making. Is that right?
I would say that's a likely or more likely outcome.
Okay. The final topic was just about the psychometric testing. I identified to you a number of what I think you described as problem areas from the psychometric report. I'm correct that these suggested a level of risk in those identified problem areas. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Now, the questions that you asked at the interview didn't provide critical information that suggested that there was further risk, correct?
Yes, the responses to the questions didn't provide further information suggesting there was risk.
But they didn't disprove the level of risk that had been identified in the psychometric battery. Is that right?
No.
All right. No further questions.
Thank you for making yourself available for a good portion of today and for all of yesterday. We appreciate the input that you've had on the inquest and the information that you've provided. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Your Honour.
See you later. Dr. Dwyer,
Your next witnesses are Sergeant Matthew Allen and Senior Constable Brad Wallace, and I call those officers.
before each of you assist us with answers to various questions, Sergeant Allen, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
I do.
And Constable Wallace, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
I do.
Thank you.
You know, just before I call or ask both officers to provide their details to the court, I note that there are a number of documents that are relevant to the officers. Firstly, starting with Senior Constable Brad Wallace, we have two statements from Senior Constable, both dated the 26th of July 2022. They are at 7133A and 7133B. And a statement from Sergeant Matthew Allen on the 11th of August 2022 at 7-2B. Just, Your Honour, for the benefit of the court and my learned friends, the statement of Hedgie Ronan Burns may also be relevant. That's on the 8th of August 2022, 7-115B. And the statement of Assistant Commissioner Smallpage, or perhaps both statements, from July and September of this year, 7-120A and 7-120B.
Thank you.
That's the housekeeping out of the way. Might I just ask for the record for you each to state your full names. Senior Constable Wallace, could you just state firstly your full name, your rank and your station?
I'm Bradley James Wallace, Senior Constable, register number 30154. I'm attached to crime in Alice Springs Station.
And I'll ask you some further details about your experiences shortly. But in the meantime, Sergeant Allen?
Matthew Glenn Allen. I'm a sergeant at the Police Fire and Emergency Services College, registered number 2081.
And where are you currently based?
At the college in Darwin.
Which is Darwin. Yeah. Thank you very much. Senior Constable Wallace, you set out some of your very interesting history with both the AFP and the Northern Territory Police Force in your first statement. I'm conscious, as the court is, of many family and community members listening into the evidence and needing to understand a little bit about that for themselves. So can I note, firstly, you're an initiated Aranda man, your country's around this area. Can you tell us about where you come from?
Yeah, that's correct. My family comes from Loves Creek Cattle Station. We're Eastern Aranda people. My mother lives on my homelands, approximately 80 kilometres east of Alice Springs.
And you've lived the bulk of your life in the Northern Territory, is that right?
I've lived all but some time spent serving with the Australian Federal Police outside of Northern Territory in Australia, within the Northern Territory.
You explain in your statement that as a young person you travelled and lived with your parents through Central Desert areas, is that right?
Yeah, through both Central Desert and through Arnhem Land as well.
You have completed a master's degree in Indigenous Knowledges and Cross-Cultural Mediation that is run through Charles Darwin University.
Yeah, that's correct. I completed that, I think it was 2015.
You explain in your statement you joined the Australian Federal Police in 1998 and worked across a variety of positions and locations. You set them out in your statement, and I won't ask you to go through all of them, but they include Joint Defence Facility at Pine Gap, the Alice Springs Aviation Team, Darwin AFP Aviation Team, the AFP Crime Operations in the Northern Territory. And relevant to some of the questions I'll ask you later in your evidence, a Family Investigations Liaison Officer, or FILO position, which exists in the AFP, but not yet in the Northern Territory, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
In 2009, you took 12 months leave without pay from the AFP and you worked for the Central Desert Shire as a regional manager for the Community Safety and Night Patrol portfolio. Can you tell Her Honour about setting up those regional areas for night patrol?
So I took a 12-month leave of absence from the Australian Federal Police, and I won a position with Central Desert Shire as they were starting to set up the community safety or the night patrols across the Central Desert region, and it was of interest for me because it's my home area, and I hadn't worked on community for some time. I had several communities that I was responsible to recruit staff and maintain facilities and vehicles at, ranging from Harts Range on the Kitchita country through to larger Manu on Gringy country, which is where there's a large Warlpiri community.
One of those communities was Inquest, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You note that as part of that role you drew up you assisted with memorandums of understanding between the Northern Territory Police, community patrollers and the Central Desert Shire?
Yes, that's correct. Part of the process that Central Desert Shire was working on at the time was to set up, author and set up memorandums of understanding between the senior night patrol officers and the station sergeants or the OICs of those communities.
You noted in your statement that project lasted for about 12 months and you went back to the AFP. Do you know whether or not those memoranda of understanding are still in existence and operational?
To be perfectly honest, I couldn't tell you. I think you'd have to get that information through Central Desert Shire or through Northern Territory Police. I'm not currently attached to remote, so I don't have knowledge if that's still the case.
We can follow up on that. You're aware that that night patrol still exists throughout the Central Desert area, at least in some communities?
Yes, I'm aware. I don't know if it's still being run and funded by the Attorney General's Department to the same standard and with the same amount of funding and staffing as it was at that time. That was a rollout as part of the intervention in the Northern Territory, so there was a lot of funding available and there was a lot of scope for us to try different things.
That might be an issue that interests the court, and we can follow that up on that. Just to finish off on your experiences before we come to the situation now, Senior Constable, you were returned to the AFP in October 2010, and then you were sworn into the Northern Territory Police Force in 2012 as a Special Constable for a particular reason. Can you tell the court about that?
I was posted and stationed to Darwin as part of being in the region in the Northern Territory, and some of the work I was undertaking. I was sworn as a Special Constable of the Northern Territory Police. My registered number at that time was 6971. I worked across several portfolios that were interactive between the Australian Federal Police and Northern Territory Police.
And did that include areas in the Central Desert, even though you were based in Darwin?
I did some work in the Central Desert. The bulk of my work was across the top end of the Northern Territory, as far down as Lajamanu.
So coming closer in time, you resigned from the AFP in July 2020 and you joined the Northern Territory Police Force as a full-time constable in the same month. You completed transition training in October 2020, that is transitioning from the AFP into the Northern Territory Police, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Is that different to the full 6-month training that you would do as a young constable?
Yeah, that's correct. It's a program that Northern Territory Police run called the Advanced Recruitment Program. I undertook that training from July to October 2020.
So it's 3 months rather than 6 months?
That's correct.
And you indicate that since you have rejoined the police force or joined the police force in the Northern Territory, you've undertaken roles in general duties, community resilience and engagement command, known as CREC, and you're currently, or at least at the time that you completed this statement, you were attached to Strike Force Viper. What was that, or is that?
Strike Force Viper is a high volume property crime unit in Alice Springs that deals with obviously high volume property crime. I'm no longer attached to Strike Force Viper. I start a position on Friday the 11th with domestic violence, so I'm in between roles at the moment.
What will be the position that you go into?
I'm going into the crime team within Alice Springs Station.
I think it brings us up to date with you, Senior Constable, and I'll return to your experience shortly. Sergeant Allen, you indicate in your statement that you commenced the role you're in now on the 15th of March 2021 as the course coordinator within the NT Police College. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's right. I was the course coordinator for Squad 145. 15th of March last year is when I started the role at the police college, and 145 is my first squad that I've put through as a course coordinator, and I'm doing Squad 149 at the moment.
And how many squads go through in a year?
I can't give you exact numbers, but 3, but it depends what squad you're talking about. Could be auxiliaries, Aboriginal community police officers, constables and ALOs. So it's very, very busy. But in terms of constables, yeah.
I've jumped forward because I haven't got you yet to properly explain what your role involves. Could you do that?
So my role I'm the sergeant of a constable squad. I'm there for their whole time as a instructor. I focus on legislation, how to put a brief of evidence together, manage them through their whole process, administrative. We have a lot of skill blocks throughout the time, what we call skills blocks, where they learn to drive a motor vehicle, firearms training, operational safety. That's taken on by other instructors, but my sole role is the course coordinator. We deal with a lot of the theory in relation to, like I said, legislation, policy, procedures. Incrementally, throughout their course.
Senior Constable Wallace just told us about the accelerated course that he did, and we've heard evidence from some officers from New Zealand who came over to the Northern Territory Police Force who also did an accelerated course. Are you responsible for course coordination of both 6 months for new recruits and the accelerated course?
No, I've never been involved in an accelerated program. It's only been Squad 145 and an ALO squad that I've been involved with.
ALO, Aboriginal Liaison Officer.
Yes.
Now, you two have met before today, obviously.
Yes, we have.
You indicate in your statement, Sergeant Allen, that on the 29th of June 2021, you officially approached Senior Constable Wallace and his management at Alice Springs Police Station. You asked him if he would come up to Darwin between dates in August 2021 to ask if he could present to 51 recruits from Squad 142.
Yeah, that's correct. So I was aware of Brad's prior involvement with other squads before the time I was at the college, and I wanted to bring that flavour and his experience to the young constables on a 3-day program, which we've put together and I can explain to the court.
And certainly I'm coming to that, and that will be extremely useful. In terms of Senior Constable Wallace, sorry to talk about you in front of you, Senior Constable. In terms of Senior Constable Wallace's presentation, we have on our brief of evidence at 12-1 a presentation that goes for 2 hours and 44 minutes, which is an example of Senior Constable Wallace's work with a group of young recruits. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Were you there at that presentation?
I wasn't there at that presentation. I haven't watched that presentation, but I've been privy in person to his presentations.
So you became aware of the work of Senior Constable Wallace, and then you asked him to help you out on the course.
Correct,
is that
yeah.
right? In relation to the course as it currently exists, as at 2022, I just want to contrast what was available to Constable Rolfe, for example, and his cohort of police officers in 2016. Miss Ronnie Burns, forgive me if I mispronounced that. Do you know whether or not I'm pronouncing the name?
Hager Running Burns.
Thank
Yep.
you. She sets out in her statement, which Her Honour has, at 7-115B, so what the course materials were when Constable Rolfe commenced his training. And they are in our brief of evidence, Your Honour, from 12-2 through to 12-6. Excuse me a moment. I printed some of these out before. Have you seen those, Sergeant Allen?
I saw those, yes, I have seen those before.
The course as it existed when Constable Rolfe did his squad training is also explained by Assistant Commissioner Smallpage in his first affidavit at paragraph 271. I'll just read it for you. He says that Constable Rolfe's squad received 1 week of cultural awareness training, which included a series of lectures around issues faced by police in remote communities and a basic introduction to Aboriginal culture. This week of training culminated in an attendance at Bagot Reserve to meet with Bagot community elders and to interact with Aboriginal youth through a game of basketball. Can I ask you to accept that we heard evidence from Constable Kirstenfeld, who appears to have had similar training? He referred to, when asked about cross-cultural training, some experiences at Bagot. He said, we met with the elder there, it was really good. Her name was Helen. We played basketball with some of the kids, and they heard about Helen's experience in terms of the tragedy of the stolen generation.
I don't dispute that. No.
Within these materials, which we have read carefully, there are, suggest to you some important things, for example, the history or part of the history of colonisation, including tragic experiences with massacres, our state-sanctioned massacres in this country, kinship and a basic understanding of kinship and a basic outline of racism. Are those themes picked up in the new training which I'm going to take you to?
Yes, most definitely.
Senior Constable, Senior Constable Wallace, before I come back to Sergeant Allen about what's changed since 2016, I just want to ask you both to reflect on this. We heard from Sergeant Kirkby, who had done an accelerated training package. in 2013 when asked to reflect on the training that he did to help him understand what he would be experiencing and how to approach cultural situations. He said he joined in April 2013. He travelled to Daly River. There was a bit of cross-cultural training delivered by, quote unquote, an Irish chap in Daly River. It was limited cross-cultural information. He described it as woefully inadequate. That's just one officer, and he's reflecting on his memory since 2013. I appreciate you both weren't in your roles then. Sergeant Allen, did it come to your attention when you took over the role in 2021 that there were serious deficiencies in training?
We could do things a lot better, and we can always do things a lot better. And obviously, with that training, the big difference is, as a course coordinator, which the role I was explaining, if I'm giving a lecture or taking a workshop about how to put a brief of evidence together, I take that workshop, I deliver that package. With the new program, we've got individuals, subject matter experts in that chosen area. For example, Brad, there's a lot of others I can get into later, that are actually delivering those workshops and presentations with the experience of being there and seeing it themselves. So that's the big difference that I can see.
And that's an important difference, and I know I've got evidence to call from you about it. Before we do, Senior Constable Wallace, when you did your accelerated training, you explained in paragraph 11, that was June 2020, you had a conversation with college staff about the provision of culturally appropriate training for members commencing their careers with NT Police. You did that because you recognised that the NT Police could and should do it better, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
What were the deficiencies that you saw, in bearing in mind it was the accelerated training package?
I saw a very basic package put together by an NGO to be delivered, followed by a basketball game, and I didn't see that as appropriate or anywhere near enough training to prepare police officers from interstate and international jurisdictions to work in the community with my people.
One thing that you point out, Senior Constable Wallace, is that many of the new recruits have had very limited engagement with Aboriginal people before they start as police in the Northern Territory. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Many of the recruits, you just mentioned international recruits as well as young people?
Yes.
So can I come to some of the changes? This was, of course, Sergeant Allen did the accelerated process before you became involved also, Senior Constable Wallace, before you became involved, Sergeant Allen. When you became involved, or both from the time you have become involved, the course content and the way it's delivered has changed substantially. Is
yes,
that right?
That's correct.
And you started to say this earlier, it's not you delivering the whole course, it's you engaging some external providers, is that right?
I would say that I arrange the presenters and facilitate the 3-day program. It's not Sergeant Allen standing there speaking about cultural competence, community engagement. So I can take you through that if you like.
I might start with that and then I'll come back to Senior Constable Wallace. So you speak in your statement, bearing in mind it's all set out here, I'm trying to draw out the important points, particularly for those listening. You set out that there are 3 specific days in terms of the cultural awareness presentations. Can I ask you to go through each day?
Yep. Just before we do that, to set the scene straight up, the first week of the police constables, we do a presentation and explain to them their life's completely changed. They're now leaders in the community, they're now training, the cultural differences, the expectations, the code of conduct, respect, equity and diversity. But right at that early moment, that first week, we deliver a project for them that gets delivered during their cultural awareness program. So it's an assignment, it's a presentation task, and I spend a bit of time explaining what is expected of them as police officers, and why they're actually sitting there wearing the uniform, trying to put it into context. Words to the effect of helping the community, leaders. That's what our role is, to serve and protect. And I focus on, it's really early, but I focus on our mission and our vision, you know, what's written on our patch, so they actually get a grasp of what they're sitting in the classroom for and where their career's going. So I give them that presentation, I issue them with this assignment, and I say to them, in 6 months' time, during the program of the 3-day cultural awareness package, you're going to do all this research in relation to a Indigenous First Nations language, and all the classrooms at the police college have names of Arunta, Anandiliakwa, all the, not every, there's so many cultures and languages,
Sure.
but there's about 13 or 14 that the recruits get allocated.
I'm going to hit Beck with this without having given her any notice, but if you have a look, Beck, please, at 7-2B, which is an attachment to Sergeant Allen's statement, you start to see some of the overheads that Sergeant Allen's referring to. So this happens at the very first week, sending the signal that this is to protect and serve, or serve and protect is on your badge, I think. Am I right about that? That's the mission for the Northern Territory Police Force.
Yeah.
And then profiling a number of different communities. And you said, and Beck will give us an example. You've mentioned Anandiliakwa, I think, and we've also got
Walpuri, Aranda, Creole, Gurindji.
And then in terms of the assignment, I think there are some parts of this that I won't put on the overhead because there's some sensitivities around ownership of the material. But the very first pages, Beck, if you can see them, it's the attachment to Sergeant Allen's statement, 7-2B, page 1 of 13.
This is the PowerPoint.
Exactly. So,
This is where you want to go.
yes, thank you very much, Ronna. So, Beck, if you could just flick through, just scan through, just backing up what Sergeant Allen's just told us. These are First Nations groups around Central Australia, and there are some from the top end. Language groups. And you just stop there. For example, Kunwinku. What's the point of that though, Sergeant Allen? Can you just drill down on what happens then in the assignment?
So with the assignment, they research a particular police station, a community within that language group, and they are asked to proactively engage with, and that means not just emailing, getting on the phone, talking to the OIC of the police station, the constable at the police station, Aboriginal liaison officer, the Aboriginal community police officer, the land council, any stakeholder of relevance out there to talk about history, current issues, police numbers, challenges, and they're starting that process. So how many people speak the language? Is there challenges in relation to whether the language is there any cultural, in terms of song lines, dance, languages where some, because they're all completely different, are some really got a strong culture today with their young kids. For example, Alawa got a great little song with all the kids that talk about we're the Alawa people, and it's real sort of interesting anecdotes in relation to that. So that's one aspect. And towards the end of the assignment, they get asked what could they do after their research to help improve community engagement and things like that.
And I think one of the questions also is, what else could you do to deepen your knowledge base?
Yeah.
Is that assignment started and finished in the first week?
No. So it's evolved in the short time that I've been there. When we first rolled it out, they were giving, unfortunately, some of the Aboriginal community police officers got a really small amount of time to do that sort of work. So you'll notice, it was about 300 words to be specific, but it's evolved now where they've given the whole course. So Squad 149 is given the whole course to work on this project. That gets delivered on the third day of their cultural awareness training, which is scheduled just before, about a week before their graduation.
So can it be, before I bring Senior Councillor Wallace in, can I ask you to go through the days of the cultural awareness program and who that is delivered by?
Yeah. I just want to, it's relevant to, during that first week, Larrakia Nation come into the police college, Janine McLennan, and she'll provide an afternoon presentation all about her culture, history of her culture, and it flows on the assignment and what I spoke to before about why they're police officers, what are they here for. It all flows into that assignment in the first week. So that's of relevance too, is during that first week, Janine McLennan does her presentation, and she'll be best placed to provide the evidence of the nuances of that presentation. But I've seen it. It covers a lot of ground from history, current day, and future Larrakia people.
When we were speaking out of court, Sergeant, you were at pains to say that you can't speak on behalf of Aboriginal people. You don't purport to be any sort of topic expert in that, do you?
No.
But you want to make sure that recruits are going to hear from First Nations people.
That's right.
And be taught by them.
Yeah.
It's totally unsatisfactory to have that delivered by somebody who's not Aboriginal.
That's correct.
Is there anything else that you want me to ask you in terms of a broad overview before we get onto the days?
That's all instructors at the college, and the feedback I've got from the recipients of the phone calls from the early days, as in the communities that are getting the phone calls about from the young police officers doing these assignments and tasks, are very receptive to speak and share information about their culture. And that's.
I'm just going to ask you then for a brief outline about the 3 days before I bring the Senior Constable in. Day one, you say of the cultural awareness program commences with a first morning run by the CREC, the Community Resilience and Engagement Command. Can you just explain that?
So that's an entire command that the Northern Territory Police have established. Engagement resilience is the focus, obviously, of that command. So representatives of the CREC will come that first morning and spend the morning with the recruits, but they speak about Aboriginal liaison officer role, responsibilities. They'll talk about individuals and their journey, and some positive, basically, roles, responsibilities. They're the eyes and ears of the police, and they're going to be the connection between us and the community. And that is explained to the recruits what their role is.
Senior Constable Wallace, you've had a role within CREC, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
What was your role in CREC?
I was the acting sergeant in CREC during the period of the Rolfe trial.
How long has CREC been in existence for?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure.
I can find those details. Do you know whether it's a relatively new concept for the Northern Territory?
It is, and it's a developing concept.
So while the Rolfe trial was going on, as you said out in your statement, there was a need for particular support to be delivered for the community?
Yeah, that's correct. For both our policing community and for the wider Aboriginal community of Central Australia, we had a really good liaison process at the time of the Walbury community here, and we were really focused on that. And that was just to alleviate some of the tensions and to develop a strong engagement and platform between the police and the community at that time.
One of the things you did was try to explain to people from Kumanjayi's family and community what was happening in the trial and what could be expected. Is that right?
To an extent, yes. I mean, they had very good advice from their own legal counsel. We were just there to ensure them that the police were still available to perform our functions and our roles on the community and to continue to build repair and continue with engagement and relationships within the community.
One of the things you did was attend the correctional facility to try and see people who were in custody and explain to them part of the process?
Yes, that's correct.
Sergeant Allen, is there anything else from that first day of presentation that you wanted to tell us about?
Before the 3-day cultural awareness new package is a number of subjects I can speak about. Unconscious bias training, mental health first aid, respect, equity and diversity, code of conduct, which I've already mentioned, trauma-informed AMSANT, Aboriginal medical advisory, Medical Services Alliance, Northern Territory. Dr. Carmen Cabillo comes with her team, and she delivers a 2-day trauma-informed package to the recruits. This is all prior to the 3 days.
I see. Well, I might start there and then go to the 3 days and try and do it chronologically. We have some information about those topics you just talked about in the statement of Assistant Commissioner Small Page. He explains that, in short, some of those topics you just talked about have been introduced relatively recently, that is, since Constable Rolfe did his training.
Yeah, so I haven't been exposed to or been aware of that training previously.
See, if I can just put this on the record so that we understand the evidence. The mental health first aid scheme, Assistant Commissioner Small Page tells us, has been in place since around January 2017. Do you see it being delivered?
Yes, I do.
What can you tell us about it? We can obtain further information, of course, from those who deliver it. Your experience of it.
Senior Constable Karen O'Dwyer is, and Marcus Tilbrook are the ones that can provide that evidence. There's a lot of workshops. There's a lot of communication in relation to strategies and understanding how mentally you can be affected by your job, essentially. And the police role is wide, a lot of responsibilities, and how to deal with that. So exercise, nutrition, all those sort of, yeah. And that's the extent in terms of mental health first aid.
I just want to stop you there for a moment. Senior Constable, did you have any mental health first aid when you started back in the accelerated course? I'm just contrasting.
Yes, it was part of our course program.
Did you find it useful?
Absolutely.
Okay. Was it delivered by Miss O'Dwyer and Mr. Tilbrook?
Yeah, I believe it was.
Okay.
So it's directed at understanding your own mental health, or is it directed at being able to provide a kind of first aid intervention with people that you encounter on the job?
Both, Rona.
Senior Constable Wallace, I'm going to ask you at some stage later to reflect on your experience of general duties when you first came to Alice Springs. I might just jump around and do it now. It was pretty confronting, was it, for you to go back to GDs?
Yeah, absolutely. Alice Springs, the Central Desert, is my home. I've been involved with law enforcement since 1998. I've worked in multiple jurisdictions as part of the Australian Federal Police, including international. By far the hardest, most brutal workplace that I've worked in is the Central Desert. It's extremely difficult, challenging, confronting, can be very violent, and it takes a lot out of you as an individual. And coming from this community and having Aranda family, Aliota family, Luricha family from across the region, and dealing with some of those traumas from within my own family group is very confronting. So it's been an experience. I'd say it's the hardest policing I've done in my 24 years.
We have had some evidence about how it can be particularly challenging for First Nations people in the role of police when they've got family and community who might be affected. For you as an Aranda man, did you find that particularly confronting?
It's confronting daily. There hasn't been a role that I've had within the Central Desert region where I haven't had to deal with my own family. So each day I come to work and I try to provide our community with the best service that I can within the auspices of what we do as police officers. I see other Aboriginal community police officers and Aboriginal constables and Aboriginal liaison officers who are exceptionally dedicated and work hard, but that's notwithstanding the very dedicated non-Aboriginal staff that we have within the Central Desert region that I work side by side with, that try exceptionally hard and try to provide the best for the community.
So I'm going to come to some reflections that you've got about ways to support people generally with your recruitment training. Was there anything that you received or learnt about in that first aid package or that equipped you when you started GDs?
Well, the package is designed to, as Sergeant Allen said, to provide a response to mental health situations within the workplace, but also to be self-aware. And it's really important doing the type of policing that we're doing here, especially in the general duties portfolio, that you're very aware of your own traumas and your own challenges within the workplace, because it is very confronting. As a local person, I always was aware. I grew up here and spent time in communities and within the township of Alice Springs. My grandparents lived in town camps within Alice Springs, so I have a long history here. I had no idea the challenges that I would face when I came back to work here.
Can you give us an idea of those? I don't want to make it too painful for you, but what were some of the challenges that were unexpected?
Can I just say, have the circumstances deteriorated from when you were here as a younger man to now? Or is it just that you're seeing it or being confronted with it more because of the role that you're fulfilling?
Possibly both, Your Honour. On reflection, my previous experience was not as a member of Northern Territory Police and not working frontline. So I knew that I was going to be challenged when I came home, and I knew I was going to be challenged working within my own clan, family and tribal groups in the wider region. But what I wasn't ready for was the day-to-day traumas and the day-to-day violence that our members deal with. And it can be very difficult, and you carry that, our members carry that daily.
And you made a point of saying the members carry it daily, Aboriginal members and non-Aboriginal members, and you work alongside both, and you see a lot of caring, committed Northern Territory police officers, is that right?
I was actually surprised when I came to Alice Springs with the Northern Territory Police at the level of commitment, and I'm here and I've stated that I will say the truth, and it was very surprising to me to see the way that especially the experienced Northern Territory police officers cared for and were invested in the community here. It was quite heartening to me. Was really shocked at the absence of racism in the muster room. It's something that I expected, having a long experience in policing and law enforcement across several jurisdictions, and with the sheer volume of work that's conducted by the Northern Territory Police that involves my people, I was expecting a lot of negativity, and I was expecting to be confronted by words, actions, and reflections that would be better placed in the past. And I do not tolerate, and anybody that's worked with me will reaffirm that I do not tolerate racism or racist practices or biased practices in the workplace. I have high expectations of myself and others, and I have nothing but praise for the general duties members that I've worked with here and by the leadership within the station, other than some of the things that have come out during this inquest.
So you started back down in Alice Springs, is it 2020 that you came back to the police force?
Yes, that's correct.
So we've got from you your experiences since from 2020 to 2022. You have experience in the police force generally before then in the AFP. Have you experienced as racism prior to that time in the NT police or police generally?
In police generally, absolutely. Absolutely. When I first joined in 1998, I faced racism in the workplace almost daily. My father was employed by the Australian Protective Service, Australian Federal Police at that period of time. And I had several discussions with people that made derogatory comments about my father being married to an Aboriginal woman. It was common in the workplace. The reference to me as being one of the good ones, or asking me why I spent time outside of work with people of colour who are my family, that was common in policing in the 90s within the organisations that I worked for. I will unequivocally say that I've had conversations with other Aboriginal members that are long-term in Alice Springs that work in the same areas that I have, and there's frustrations in policing in Alice Springs, and sometimes those frustrations lead to comments or conversations, and they can be a little bit confronting, but overall, I can't say that I've seen great levels of racism in the muster room here, if any. What I see is a group of people working in an exceptionally challenging environment, trying to do their best to protect this community.
So we have in this inquest some phone messages from Constable Rolf's phone where he's communicating with a number of police in 2019. And it's from those phone messages that the court has come to understand the racist language that was used by a number of officers, a number of constables, 3 constables, including Constable Rolf, and then 2 sergeants, including the sergeant who was the head of the IRT and the sergeant who was operating on Constable Rolf's patrol group. I'm not going to repeat the language, Senior Constable Wallace, but you've obviously heard it through the media, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And that's a snapshot in time, at least, in 2019, and from a number of officers in the command. That's not something, well, how did you feel about it?
As a police officer, I'm disgusted. As an Aboriginal man, I'm angry and I'm hurt.
And is it your perception that others in your family and community feel the same way?
100%.
No doubt the court will be relieved to hear that your experiences have been different in Alice, but where to from here in terms of starting to address the hurt and the pain caused?
This is the thing that I found frustrating about the release of those messages through this inquest. I'm in my 25th year of law enforcement. I've seen some really positive changes, and I've seen the diminishing impact of racism in the workplace. I think both the jurisdictions that I've been employed from have come ahead leaps and bounds in the employment, retention and recruitment of Aboriginal staff. I've seen different programs put in place to address attitudes and issues, and that's shown through the programs that Sergeant Allen is trying to get up and running and improve at the PFES College in Darwin. But what really impacted me was that after 24 years, the same language was being used, albeit on what those members thought was a private platform. I know some of the members involved. I don't know all of the members involved. I've worked with some of the members involved, and I'm deeply hurt and disappointed. Have I seen and heard that racism in person? No, I haven't. But that doesn't diminish how it makes me feel, because it makes me reflect on how those officers would view my family members walking down the street in their roles, and whether they had formed biases about them prior to dealing with them. And I can't say that because I can't talk for them. That's just how I feel. As a police officer, like I said, I'm disgusted that that type of language was being used on any platform. And I'm deeply disappointed that it wasn't addressed by people that were within leadership roles within that group.
No doubt a number of your colleagues in the Northern Territory Police Force, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, feel the same way. Any officers who are non-Indigenous spoken to you about the way they feel about that treatment?
Absolutely, and it's been really heartening to have some of those conversations, especially with some of our more senior members. And I'm not talking about senior by rank, I'm talking about senior by service or through their actions within the organisation. It's been quite heartening, but that doesn't diminish the effect that that type of incident has on how we are reflected by the community, how I'm reflected as an Aboriginal man wearing this uniform, how my own family sees me wearing a uniform that can be associated with racism. It hurts.
So there's a long way to rebuild the trust after this. Is that fair, Senior Constable?
I think we're doing the right things to try and rebuild that trust. I think that what Sergeant Allen's doing at the college and some of the processes that have been put in place are addressing those issues. Even though I'm angry and a little bit hurt by what's come out during the inquest, then perhaps it had to in order for us to move forward.
One of the young officers, I don't know whether you've been following the evidence every day, but one of the young officers who was involved in the patrol group, Constable Hanson, was visibly upset when he was giving evidence, reflecting on his own behaviour. He gave evidence, I don't know, did you hear any of his evidence?
No, I didn't.
He gave evidence that he has had some time to reflect on it. He's grown. He's got his own child during that period of time that's grown up, and he was deeply disappointed and ashamed with his own behaviour. And but he owns it. It's been a period of learning and reflection. Is that any significance to you, hearing it as an R&D man?
Yeah, I think that anybody can learn from their behaviours and become educated and change. I think the basis for most racist comments and racist attitudes in our community, whether it's against Aboriginal people or anybody from any other ethnic group, is based on ignorance and a lack of education. So as a younger man, I used to get very angry about racism because it was so in my face, but as a middle-aged person who's educated myself, I think the best way to move forward is to have those hard conversations and educate people. I think attitudes can be changed. Doesn't mean that there's a basis there for forgiveness. I mean, the first thing I thought when I heard that there were some apologies being given for comments that have been made is, are you sorry you said it, or are you sorry you got caught? So those members may be sorry, but, you know, for myself and perhaps for some of the other Aboriginal members within the organisation and some of our non-Aboriginal staff who try so hard to build those bridges with the community and work effectively, the damage is there, you know. So
For that young constable, he actually grew up with Aboriginal people, has Aboriginal friends, and went to them, explained what had happened, and faced them. That's that young officer. We have heard from one sergeant and not the other. And would it surprise you to think that people at the level of sergeants are not only not picking up, or they were, these two at least in those circumstances, not only not picking up younger officers for the language, but actually participating in it?
it does surprise me in 2022 that that wasn't addressed by leadership.
Sergeant Allen, when you are educating young recruits and you've had an experience of a number of groups, are there some attitudes being expressed? Well, I withdraw that. I'll just ask this question. Are people encouraged to speak freely so that...
I'll just draw quickly on what Senior Constable Wallace was talking about. Sergeants are some of the most influential rank in our whole jurisdiction, and strong leadership is required to stamp out this behaviour. From a college perspective, I already mentioned the code of conduct is abundantly clear to them that first week, you know, where we take it through what's on and off duty, what's acceptable behaviour and what's not. I just wanted to add that. Sorry, what was your question?
I guess what I'm coming to is, are there some attitudes expressed by recruits that surprise you, that are prima facie racist?
No, not. I want to talk about down the track in the evidence, the panel, where we have experienced Indigenous officers and they're encouraged to ask whatever question or have any discussion on any topic they like. The squad at the moment that I've got is so diverse. There are individuals from so many different backgrounds, nationally, internationally. There's zero tolerance for that sort of behaviour and language at the training college. It's stamped out, made abundantly clear in that first week.
I think Senior Constable Wallace referred to the fact that a lot of racism stems from ignorance, and the panel presentation which you're coming to is an opportunity to sort of dispel some stereotypes. Is that right?
Yeah.
So you've set out day one at paragraph 9 of your statement. You explain that there's involvement from CREC. The Aboriginal Interpreter Service conducts a presentation and workshop with the recruits.
Yep, so Mandy Matt and her team come in once the CREC is finished. She does a presentation in relation to the service provided by Aboriginal Interpreter Service. They do some role playing, speaking to individuals from non-English speaking backgrounds and the benefits of using an interpreter. Again, any specifics in relation to her presentation, she can give that evidence, but that's the second part of the program on that first morning, and it's about an hour, two hours, yeah.
Then the afternoon session is a 2-hour presentation from the Multicultural Council of the Northern Territory by the President of the Council, Dr. Joseph.
Edwin Joseph, yeah. So one of the documents you had earlier is a multicultural document. We've reached out to the Multicultural Society, and Dr. Edwin Joseph comes and provides a presentation He speaks about, from a Darwin top-end point of view, Filipino, Indonesian population, migrants, refugees, and the challenges, the experiences some of these individuals might have with police nationally or internationally, and how to treat and respond and be aware that experiences overseas, experiences nationally, may be affecting these migrants' behaviours when dealing. So takes it through topics in that package there, but I was only speaking to Dr. Joseph the other day. There's a lot more work that can be refined in terms of specific subjects that he can speak about, essentially. He does a big Q&A session and, again, takes a lot of questions from the group, and he does it in the auditorium at the college.
Sergeant, just so the evidence makes sense to those listening, you're pointing to a document on my bar table which is Policing Between Cultures, Multicultural Awareness, which is a series of PowerPoints that we have at 12-3 in our brief of evidence. Is that right?
That's right. And it's my understanding that even though I wasn't at the college, packages like that probably may have been delivered by somebody in my role.
I see. So now you bring in external experts to deliver them. Yeah. Is that right? Day 2, which you explained to us in your statement, can you, this is from paragraph 10, that's hosted by Jason or Philip Elsgood from Cross Cultural Consultants. Could you explain what that organisation is?
So that's an external organisation, a consultant, professional body that specifically deals with cross-cultural training, and they've been formally engaged by the Northern Territory Police only very recently, as recent as last year, July, August last year, to deliver a one-day package. Now, I've sat and been present with Jason's package, extremely engaging with the recruits. He starts off setting the scene about statistics nationally compared to the Northern Territory, population of Indigenous people in the Northern Territory, the communities, 70 odd communities. We're aware of our police stations. I think we've got about 50 remote communities, outstations, really setting the scene about the importance and the relevance of cross-cultural training at the start. He also spends a lot of time going from 1770, the start of colonisation, Billamuck's brother, Pemulwuy, all the way up to census, curfews in Darwin, really setting that scene. Also, the culture of individual culture versus collective, collectivism. And Jason, again, is the person to give that evidence. But from what I've observed from the recruits' engagement, participation, and we have we call surveys, where they provide the feedback, they get a lot out of that particular day.
Just to be clear, so it's on the record, Jason is a First Nations.
Yes, he's a Larrakia man. Yeah.
And so just Senior Constable Wallace, that was not something that was available in the accelerated program that you did, is that right?
No, it wasn't available.
I'll come to day 3 and then I want to bring you back in, Senior Constable Wallace, about your reflections. Day 3, you explain, Sergeant commences with a panel of Indigenous NT police officers who share their policing experiences, generate discussions on a range of topics and answer some questions. Is this was this how you came to meet Senior Constable Wallace, because Senior Constable Wallace came in for day 3?
Yes. And no, sorry, that's not where I met him.
Right.
No.
Okay.
No. I had some time with the Federal Police a long time ago. I met Brad there many years ago, 2010.
But
So,
in terms of, that was
yes.
my clumsy question. Senior Constable Wallace came in to deliver on the day 3 sessions.
Yes, but more importantly, in the June this year, it wasn't just day 3. He was actually present throughout the whole 3 days from a police officer's perspective, and added a lot of value to a lot of the discussions that were generated throughout that week. But the main reason was, yes, for the 3rd day in the morning with the panel, and also to be present when the recruits do their presentations and offer some feedback and some value adding to their presentations.
I'll just ask you about day 3 generally and then loop back to what Senior Constable Wallace is able to contribute if he can be there for longer. Day 3 commences with a panel of Indigenous NT police officers sharing their policing experiences. You explain that session is generally facilitated by yourself or other course coordinators, and you set out how long it runs for. You say at 10:45 the NLC, that is the Northern Land Council, and traditional owners and rangers attend and provide a presentation to recruits until 12 p.m. And then the recruits are able to provide some refreshments for the gathering, that is for the group who's still there, is that right?
Yeah, so in the morning we have the panel. We invite the experienced police officers. We invite them to stay for the NLC presentation, Northern Land Council. The recruits actually cook a barbecue for everybody, including college management, where we have informal conversations, refreshments, a photo, and then we go back after lunch and the formal presentations are delivered, hopefully with the audience of Northern Land Council, experienced police officers who are operational. Some of them can't stay the whole time. People like Senior Constable Wallace, college management, and people from the Sea Rangers who aligned with the Northern Land Council. So, and the experienced officers could be Tiwi based, Daly River, Aranda, try to get the cross section, but it's difficult depending on operational requirements, leave, rostering.
Sure.
So,
Is that the recruits delivering their assignment, in effect,
Yes.
to that audience?
yes.
That's a big audience to have to deliver your
It's,
assignment.
I've actually got photos of it because it paints 1,000 words. It's actually really good to see. I wish I had some recordings of the actual day to show you, but I do have photos to show the court. Yeah, because if you're given a presentation about Tiwi and you've got an officer there who's lived and worked and grown up in Tiwi who's listening to it, then we use that to emphasise to them their research project, effort, work ethic.
Have you got those photos with you,
Yeah,
Sergeant?
I do.
During the short afternoon break, I might get you to pull them up so you can show them to us.
Yeah.
Is that an opportunity for, we talked earlier about stereotypes and some of the unconscious bias that might be exhibited. Is it an opportunity for recruits to get some feedback?
So, not so much during the presentations, but the panel discussions in the morning, anything's on on the table in terms of discussions. I go through, or the course coordinator, other course coordinators will go through and basically get, for example, if it was Mr. Wallace, straight off, tell us your story. How did you become a police officer? Tell us your family structure. Tell us some examples of challenges you've had in the workplace. Give us some ideas, insight into community engagement initiatives. So the names are in my statement. Detectives or investigators that are working in domestic violence: Danielle Chisholm, Lisa Birkenhagen, Glenn Coonan, Ricky White, Carl Gunderson, Nathan Mayo, big cross-section of individuals. It's really valuable for the recruits to hear their story, but it's not always the same people due to the reasons I discussed.
Sure, and you list 14 names in your statement of people who are helping out there. One thing I wanted to ask you about is the unconscious bias training. We know from Assistant Commissioner Small-Page's training that as a result of coronial findings, the inquest into the death of Kumanjayi Green, the findings were released in June 2018. In that case, the coroner was critical of police investigations on the basis of possible institutional racism. And on the 5th of November 2021, there was an online unconscious bias training package created and approved for release. And there's been some unconscious bias training introduced in the college. Is that right?
Yes, Annika Freeling does the unconscious bias training.
Does that happen before or after the panel discussion?
Before. Yep.
You said there's an opportunity for people to ask questions. Is there an opportunity for questions to be asked anonymously, as in written down? And
No.
You might get some harder questions and some issues that people are grappling with in relation to their own doubts and lack of knowledge, if they didn't have to stand up and expose it in front of everybody.
With, Your Honour, with the trauma-informed training and the squad, the trauma-informed training emphasised creating a safe work environment. I'm not disputing what you said. By the time they come to seeing the squad develop, by the time they come towards the end of their training, there are a lot of discussions about a range of topics: racism, stolen generation, workplace behaviours.
It would be interesting to get them to write some questions right at the beginning.
Yeah.
They might not still be questions at the end, but it would be interesting to reflect on what their questions were at the beginning.
Yeah.
Senior Constable Wallace, when we were speaking outside of the courtroom, I think you gave me an example of something that you might say to recruits, and from your own experience of how you, as an Arundel man, have experienced the restrictions at bottle shops. Is that something that you have shared with recruits?
Oh,
was that
sorry. For example, one of the experienced officers addressed the group about when he was in plain clothes trying to buy alcohol, and how he was questioned in relation to, do you have a job, where do you live, really confronting stuff. And when you've got an experienced Aboriginal police officer standing there telling recruits that you can't make a judgment based on, he's got tattoos like Mr. Wallace has, and in plain clothes, that the last person that individual thought, the liquor inspector, was that he was actually a police officer.
So that Aboriginal man's been stereotyped by a liquor inspector, and he's able to tell the recruits.
But he's sharing that story with the with the young recruits, which has to be of benefit to their development and training.
Senior Constable Wallace, have you been asked some questions that you've found confronting or ignorant, or what's your experience of it?
Well, I actually encourage the recruits to ask questions that are confronting, and you know, if it comes from a space where their ignorance is based on lack of understanding, then it's not necessarily ignorance, it's a lack of understanding. So we create that environment where they feel comfortable to ask those questions without being judged. Then I think it's a positive environment, and that's what we try to create. I know that you've watched my presentation, and I can be a bit rough in my delivery sometimes, but I try to get across to them that, you know, you can't judge people, you can't stereotype people. Every tribal group, every person, city people, bush people, we're all different, and we all need to be taken on face value. And you know, one of the biggest issues with policing is dealing with dehumanisation of people that are subjects of our investigations, and that's something that needs to be covered really strongly.
When I was watching your presentation, it appeared to me that the recruits were genuinely very engaged in it and really interested in how you delivered it, and that was over the 2+ hours, nearly 3 hours. Is that how you experience it?
When I'm delivering?
Yes.
I really enjoy delivering to those classes. I can see the benefit in it. One of the reasons why I started doing those was because I wasn't satisfied with what was provided to me at the college. And with a background with my university studies and my background within my own tribal group, I'm certainly not an authority figure within my own tribe. I'm not an elder. I don't hold a strong position within my tribe. I'm just another man. But I have a knowledge base based upon my own life experience that can be beneficial. So I have a bit of a reputation for opening my mouth at the best of times. So I put myself in the position where I could share that experience with the recruits, and the feedback's been very positive. A lot of those recruits I now work on the road with in Alice Springs, so I have worked on the road with and have interacted with them through my position within Strike Force Viper, and I'm sure I'll continue to within my roles down here. I think that first really positive, strong interaction at the college goes a long way to laying a platform to how those members will deal with the confronting challenges policing are going to bring them within the Northern Territory.
Is it, just before we have a break, can I ask you, Senior Constable Wallace, given with, of course, the need to be sensitive to Kumanjayi's family and community, but just in terms of helping recruits to understand the pain that's been caused by the inquest, do you think it's a good thing to be able to bring up with recruits what's been uncovered in the course of the inquest?
I think it has to be. I think for my organisation, the Northern Territory Police, to move forward, I think for the Warlpiri community to move forward, for the community as a whole to acknowledge that the situation's occurred and that appropriate measures are being taken based upon what's going to come out of this inquest. I think that it's a conversation that has to happen. The only way to address issues within our own community is to be honest and courageous, and sometimes have conversations that none of us feel comfortable with. That's how my mother, my grandmother, and every Aboriginal person in Australia's ancestors going back to the time of colonisation have dealt with what's happened to them and what's put us in the position we are now, where we're moving forwards and there's a future ahead of us, you know. From the time, you know, my mother was a member of the stolen generation. My mum came home to her own country. My mother was confronted with racism. She was a corrections officer for quite a long time. And, you know, for things to have moved forward from her time to my time, it's had to have been courageous and honest. I think it needs to continue.
Thank you. Is that a convenient time you wanted to take a short break for the afternoon?
Yes.
Yeah, we come back at 4:30. I just nowhere at a tight time.
All stand for your questions separation.
So I can see you just sent me the general order, but there's that category as well. Part of the general order.